Good afternoon or good evening. I'm happy to start the last panel of this conference, and I'm happy to introduce you my the panelists of this panel, the participants. So here is Jarosław, a famous Ukrainian historian and professor of Catholic University in Lviv, and who also wrote, if I'm not mistaken, the guidebook to Ukraine, published by Critica Politichna. So probably you read this book, some of you. Also, it's Hnatiuk, who is professor of Warsaw University and who is a researcher and scholar in Ukrainian issues, and who wrote a lot of books, but one of them is Courage and Fear, which I think somehow refers to probably to our today's issues. And of course, Andrew Wilson, I guess most of you know this person. It's a famous historian and political scientist, and he also wrote a book which is really close related to today's topic, which called Ukrainian Crisis, which was Ukrainian Crisis, what West need to know. So probably he's gonna tell us today what you're gonna know about, what you should know about Ukrainian crisis. But and the topic of this panel is Ukraine. The question of this panel is Ukraine abandoned? Is the West going to trade Ukraine off for Russia's support in the Middle East? And to be honest, I would like to start this panel with probably critique of this question, because for me it sounds not really relevant. And I would like to actually reformulate or modify it somehow, and I explain why. Because, by the way, I was not introduced myself. I'm Lesia Kulchynska, and I'm from Kiev, and I'm not political scientist. I work at Visual Culture Research Center, so I most deal with culture. But here I'm a representative of Ukrainian society, and of course, being a representative of Ukrainian society, I have no other option than to see the situation from so to say, Ukrainian perspective. And this is what I want to introduce here, because I feel it's missing at this conference a little bit. I was present yesterday at this first panel, and Peter Pomerantsev said that my data is that the main discourse of today's Moscow is, which Moscow's Russian propaganda uses, is conspiracy theories. And he said that it's really effective because it leaves no room for action. Because when you believe in the total conspiracy that all of politics are made somewhere by some shadow subject behind the curtain, you just have no capacity to intervene to this like hidden scene where your fate is designed. And I agree actually with this statement very much. And I can see it also in Ukraine media. I can see this Russian propaganda, how this Russian propaganda work in Ukraine media also, especially after Maidan, because it was really like spreading, this notion that there is a huge conspiracy, that Maidan was kind of puppet, that we all are victims of some conspiracy, so to say. And what is discouraging for me in this conference, that for me, the yesterday discussions and somehow today also sounds quite in line with this conspiracy narrative, conspiracy worldview, because we were discussing here a lot of like the main metaphors we use here is big players, real players, which are playing some big political game on the grand scene. And we're talking about the interests. We're trying to guess like the interests of this player, trying to calculate their strategies. Yesterday we tried to guess the Russians' master plan. We tried now at this panel we have to guess the West's intentions towards Ukraine and so on. So today discussion implies that we should try to guess the strategic tricky play of the two main players or actors, like the West and Russia, which for me sounds like big mythological figures, characters with a long history actually. So there is some kind of scene as some kind of strategic play between these major real political actors. And of course, this is quite discouraging for Ukrainian representative, because it leaves no room for Ukraine, because Ukraine in this real political play is kind of object which could be exchanged, or strategic tool that could be used somehow, or victim that could be or should be helped or should not be helped, again out of some strategic calculations of these real players. And of course, it seems to me that this kind of geopolitical narrative misses something important. First of all, when we talk about political players, probably we forget that there is also such thing as political subject. And when we talk about these geopolitical strategies, benefits and threats, probably we forget that there is also such thing as political will. And when we talk about these actors which are actually political elites, some forces, we forget that there is also society and the people with their own agenda. And while we are discussing here what West and Russia are going to do with Ukraine as this, coin to exchange, I think what is important that at this very moment some important process is going on in Ukraine, actually, in Ukrainian society, because Ukrainian society lives through the very important moment of, I believe, of achieving its own political subjectivity and political agenda. So, again, I'm not a political scientist or a military expert, so probably my view is quite naive, but it's defined mostly by experience of the Maidan, which I cannot not take into account, of course. And which proved for me that this kind of people and people's political will and these political beliefs is actually a force, a political force also. So I think we should take it into account. But probably I'm wrong. So I would like actually to address this question to the experts, to the participants of the panel, and my question is the following. Is in a situation of today's European crisis or today's European challenges, should we take Ukraine into account as a political subject, or as we say it here, a player or an actor who can somehow define the situation or define the future of the structure of the world to live? Or am I completely naive and wrong? So this is my question for you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Ja jestem
Thank you very much. It's only my second day here in Warsaw, and my Polish is a bit rusty, so if you allow me to speak English, I will much appreciate it. It's easier for me to make mistakes in a language that is relatively foreign to most of us, rather than in a language which you all know very well.
The impression is that we don't have a response to any question, to any serious question, because we live in the time when nothing is for sure, nothing is kind of sustainable, so to say. There is a Russian word for that situation. I don't believe there's some translation in Polish. Ola just told me that probably some possible translation, but the Russian word is bezvremenie, bezczasie, which means there's not just no time. Nobody sees what's going on, as a matter of fact, because we go so profound transformation where no visible actors are still there. Everything is changed, and we are depending on the next factor which is known, like who will be the next president of the United States, what will happen to the European Union, what, and this is probably the most important question we so far nobody touched, what would happen with Russia in 5-10 years? Why we not taking account that Russian regime is not sustainable? Why haven't discussed it? We have discussion for 2 days, nobody touched this issue. For Ukrainian point of view, but not just for Ukrainian point of view, there are many experts say it's hard to believe that Russia is sustainable for, say, 5-10 years. What would happen with this part of Europe like Russia would, Putin regime would collapse. To me, this kind of discussion we have right now is like having discussion on the, let's say, 1983. What would happen to Poland? 2 years before Gorbachev would come to power. What I'm saying here that geopolitical situation is quite not clear. And since we are dependent much on geopolitical situation, we just could not give the real answer. But it doesn't mean we didn't have to try. At least give. So my first answer, take this question that has been formulated as a panel seriously. And this is what I'm here solidarizing with Lesia, because it's not the issue that Ukraine doesn't have a help or attention from West. Just to prove, imagine situation when Schroeder is in Berlin, Berlusconi is in Rome, Sarkozy is in Paris, and this happens during the Russian attack on Ukraine. What will be consequences then? What if Putin, which people I believe, could talk not with the one center in Europe, but with each of these leaders separately? Would they swallow the same way a Ukrainian crisis like it did it with Georgia, so to say? This at least shows you that there's some kind of support, and this support was essentially believe what happened in the result of the crisis in Ukraine. Also, issue of sanctions. This also gives you the idea that actually this is something which is supposedly seriously taken into account. The problem is that this help or assistance comes too little and, most importantly, too late. Because there is a very small window of opportunity. When this would help, this help could help immensely to transform, to start with Ukrainian reforms. Probably some period between the March 1913 and March 1914, a year after Maidan. When Ukrainian society was on the rise, there was a lot of expectations like that, and it's before Syrian crisis. Unfortunately, it never happened, and I believe this window of opportunity is already missed. And Ukraine is losing this 15 minutes of glory, so to say. And I believe in this conference, the idea of this agenda of this conference, that Ukraine comes as the last in this conference. And most of the key speakers already left the conference. It's give you an idea about the real situation in Ukraine. In a sense, give you the idea. So, is this, what does it mean? In kind, how I take it, how I read the situation? I would say the situation, since Ukraine has already missed its window of opportunity, so most likely we are facing a long period of stagnation in Ukraine, with a very deep political crisis, with a dysfunctional state, with a huge economic problems, and things like that. And my reading is that within these circumstances, Ukraine could live practically forever. This will be stagnation, which could be last 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it takes. This already with Ukraine proved. Ukrainians are very good in surviving. When it comes to surviving, they do it brilliantly, so to say. Probably next to Poles, so to say, in this sense. So in this sense, I see we are entering in the period of the deep political crisis, the political turbulence. With new emerging new political actors in Ukraine is already in the stage. Also, we will have a huge economic problem, but this is not a secret anymore. We're now facing that. So in this sense, my take of the situation is rather pessimistic. In the short term, don't expect anything good from Ukraine because we lose this window of opportunity. Having said that, I don't believe the situation is totally desperate, because I believe that Ukraine is returning two things that happened in Ukraine. One that has been really changed, and the second has not changed. The first thing that Ukraine has been changed really, Ukraine is now leaving Russian space. And I believe Ukraine crossed the point of no return. This was the most important moment or result of the recent developments. And most importantly, that it happens not in the western Ukraine or in Kyiv, it happened in eastern Ukraine. Putin very much hated not in Lviv or Kyiv, but also in Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa, and other cities. And surveys show that. So they believe Ukraine has passed the border, so Ukraine embarked on one riverbank, the polities where we go to, it's not clear, but still this something has been achieved. On the high prices, yes, but still, if you count on the other scenarios, the price was relatively, let's say, relatively small. The thing that Ukraine could not change is this kind of the strategy of development. And the strategy was until then, langsam but sicher. Slow changes, but rather minor changes, not quite noticed, but still they give kind of cumulative effect. So it takes years and years and years to get some kind of the deeper change. Maidan, the second Maidan, created opportunity that this strategy could be changed. They will give some like a radical reform, change the trajectory, get into other states. Now we have to forget about that. Ukraine is returning to this kind of the strategy, langsam, aber sicher. So, which means that Ukraine is not a sprinter. Ukraine is a styer. And this is what we have to understand. So, when you're talking about the future Ukraine, I'm rather pessimistic about next 1 to 5 years. When talking about the styer perspective, as a historian, I believe we're more or less Ukraine on the right track. We have kind of corridor, which could still proceed. My guess will be like the next 20, 25 years. And the next 20, 25 comes from my idea or my studies, hypothesis, that what we have right now is a new generation. Probably is the main asset of Ukrainian state for the last 25 years is the emerging of this situation, of this young generation. And you've seen it on Maidan. It's very much different than the older generation. In my guess, my take will be that in some sense, Ukraine now reminds of the Europe of the 60s, because the kind of real gap between the generation. So if this generation would raise to the age of 40, 45, and biologically they'll took the power, so most likely we'll be living in this Ukraine. I'm not saying this is only scenario. I'm saying that this is just, we have a corridor. We don't know whether we have a new window opportunity or not. Probably we'll have, probably not, but the thing is we just be happy, be ready for this kind of new opportunity. So what I'm saying here, the most crucial thing is here, is first, we have a new society in Ukraine. I'm not looking at the whole society. I'm not about what is called civil society. It has not been before the first Maidan, even before the second Maidan. We have seen it now. It's a very mobilized, it's a very structured, it's looking for agenda. And the main challenge is now how to transform this horizontal ties of the civic society in the political vertical. But they believe this is something we will be witnessing in the next few years. And the second issue is, and I believe this is most important, that Ukraine could not transform itself. Ukraine is too weak to be transformed itself. So therefore, we have to think about strategic alliances between so-called West, we know whatever this means, and these fragment segments of the Ukrainian society who are really interesting or willing, have a will for political reform. And here is something which is very simple. Talking about reforms in Ukraine, this must be structural, deep reforms. Ukraine could not do it because of the various weaknesses, but most important from the economic weaknesses, because each reform has a price. It's a real price, which is counted in millions euros or dollars, to say, which means that Ukraine structurally, in various West counts, Ukraine needs a kind of Marshall Plan, which is essentially for bringing this country into new, should say, stage. This idea has been raised by Slavik Sorokovsky, I believe December 1913, in New York Times. I know that many people took this idea very, say, ironically, critically, whatever it means, naively, so to say, critically, but I believe it's a very serious idea, because look what George Soros is talking. He's talking most likely the same thing. If you're interested in Ukraine, you have to have a Marshall Plan. And here comes the European Union. Does European Union have this money? Probably not. But talking about the European Union, talking about probably Germany, probably West, probably, I mean, I could not discuss this here because it'll be like just idle talking. But if we are to bear responsibilities for the loss of the chance, it's also part of this responsibility falls also on the Western society, because very short period of time, there has been a chance to achieve much more with less of, say, resource than it's now. Thank you so much.
Dziękuję bardzo. Ja będę mówić.
Thank you very much. I will speak Polish. I would like to relate to what had been said in the introduction by Lesia, but also what Sławko Grecon, the excellent previous speaker spoke. First of all, subjectivity. If we formulate, we express the title of this panel in a different way, a more metaphorical, what we would get, or at least I will take advantage of our overused metaphor of a suitcase without a handle. It's difficult to carry, but it's a pity to leave it behind. So this is the essence of lack of subjectivity, and I do believe that can be best expressed by this metaphor. I always protested against this metaphor, or such a metaphor, with respect to the whole of Ukraine, or its part, be it Donbass, bigger or smaller portion. It seems to me that it's not a legitimate statement if we become aware that within the last 2 years, immense geopolitical shift has come to occur. How did it happen? Well, this was made by free citizens through their protest. It's truly an immense geopolitical change. A few years back, we had attended a conference, I and Jarosław, and where there was a debate on the European character of Ukraine. And one of the more important theses of that conference was the following, namely, that what we're witnessing is a long-term geopolitical change, and that Ukraine, for a long period, will be in the gray zone. Not more than 2 years passed when this forecast was completely torn down. Equally quickly, another conviction fell, namely that Ukraine is and will remain forever within the Russian sphere of influence. I would like to quote one of the poems popular in early 2014, Nikogda nie budiem radiem. This was a poem that was played in the social networks, and very quickly it became quite popular, and this cultural proximity with Russia is still an important factor. But as Jarosław mentioned, what happened is that a certain point of no return has been trespassed, has been crossed in terms of relations with Russia. And I'm convinced that even the strongest and most powerful Russian propaganda, and it is powerful, and it can really confuse the minds of even strong, intelligent people. So the Russian propaganda is turning the minds not only of their own citizens, but it is also playing havoc with the minds of Western public opinion, and in a serious manner. In terms of the notions, terms. I am a philologist. So the terms of a Russian crisis, Lesia used in her introductory remarks a different statement. She called it a European crisis. But in Europe, we're speaking of a Ukrainian crisis. Well, I think the situation ought to be defined completely differently. I agree not only with Jarosław Hrycak, but also with Konstanty Gebert, namely that we have this level of complication in terms of the situation, that thinking in a dichotomy or bipolar way is thinking that is not much better than thinking in the categories of the conspiracy theory, which is something that the Russian propaganda is trying to push down on us. So this conviction that the West or that the world is not interested in Ukraine, it's really part of this thinking, namely this conviction, convincing the entire world, particularly Ukraine, as Kutma tried to convince the Ukrainian people that in Europe nobody wants us, that they're not waiting for us in Europe. So now, in a similar manner, public opinion is told that there are other points, other items on the agenda that are much more important. I wouldn't say that Ukraine is a priority. I wouldn't make that claim, but today Ukraine is a country where very important processes are taking place, important also from the intellectual point of view, which ought to be taken into account and described. And it's a challenge not only for anthropologists of culture, it is a challenge also for political scientists. It is a challenge for sociologists to try to describe what happened within the Ukrainian society. Until recently, without a doubt, 20 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, actually, defining Ukrainianship was in Poland. How would we describe it? By language, culture? Until 1990, also Catholic religion. In the Ukraine, a similar ethnic understanding of Ukrainianship was still dominant a dozen or so years ago. But what we have today is a situation that is worthy of an intellectual reflection. Mustafa Najem, born in Kabul in Afghanistan in 81, if I remember correctly, he is this person who, through his appeal, is this impetus to start Maidan. We have also one of those recent scandals, and there are plentiful scandals, but where don't we have scandals? Is Poland free of scandals? Is France free of scandals? Of course not. But one of the recent scandals is the following: when there was a fight between Arsen Avakov, an Armenian born in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, with Mikhail Saakashvili, who I think needs no introduction. And the axis of that dispute, this argument, was which of them had better served Ukrainian interest. This is an example, another yet example, of going beyond ethnical divisions. So neither the language, nor national origin, nor cultural origin were equally well. This could have been a Muslim or a Jew, or an Orthodox, or a Roman Catholic, or atheist. So it doesn't matter. So we are witnessing completely or totally different, the emergence of a different society. One could say that Ukraine was a multinational country, and this was part of the Soviet project of mixing this melting pot of nations, sort of, as opposed to the US melting pot. And what is happening now is also clearly visible. It's subjectivity, being a subject. I don't want to abuse dignity, the word dignity, but it's in the name of such fundamental values as dignity, and that the developments were as they were in the Ukraine. And in conclusion of my statement, I would like to also recall one more issue. The association agreement, the failure to sign which was really the beginning of the situation in the Maidan. It was this horizon of hope, what we call in Ukrainian, the horizon spodziewań, which was been created by also the European Union, or even a project that was a lame project, such as Eastern Partnership, but also Yanukovych. And the failure to sign the association agreement had triggered the outcomes that it has. But one has to remember that this horizon of expectations, the expectations generated by the European Union and by Mr. Yanukovych, have resulted in, or have been the starting point of very serious processes, very grave processes. And this accountability, this responsibility for the awakened hopes within the Ukrainian society lies not only within the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian society, and I go back here to the statement of Konstanty Gebek, but it's an accountability and responsibility of the European Union, or generally speaking, the West, for having created this horizon of hope. And it's no accident that in December 2013, those protesting, citizens protesting in the Maidan, disillusioned and actually infuriated with this complete lack of help or assistance, put forward a slogan: EU, act or fuck off. I do apologize for this language. So there is a Polish saying, he who gives quickly gives twice as much, gives twofold. So that I'd like to go back to what Jarosław Hrycak had said. Ukraine needs assistance, needs sensible, quick help. And it's not a request of a loan or a sack, bottomless sack. of money, a pot of money, but Ukraine is now a test of democracy. And in conclusion, allow me to tell you also about something that I've been recently engaged in. And hence I had very little sleep, and that's possibly my presentation, my statement is so disjointed. That is the defense of Savchenko. It so happens I had initiated a letter to European leaders, in which letter I stated that whether we are able to defend Savchenko will be a test for European democracy and the ability and our espousal of those European values. So for me, the response was also a surprise, because not only that had a couple of hundred renowned intellectuals signed this letter, just to mention three Nobel Prize winners, Svetlana Aleksandra, Frida Ilieniuk, and Herzi Miller, but also a whole group of intellectuals had to put their name to this letter. So it's not just intellectuals who publicly were sensitive to this appeal. It's really tens of people who signed this appeal within just a spell of few days. So for me, this is a small evidence within this case, with respect to this case, that this is a test case to determine to the extent of our being true to European values. As I'm apologizing for being so using such lofty terms, but sometimes there comes a moment when it is a question of to be or not to be. Thank you.
I apologise for switching back to English, however. It's a pleasure to be at a conference organised by the intelligent left, particularly because Britain hasn't got one anymore. And especially because the kind of left that have taken over the British Labour Party is at its stupidest when it talks about Eastern Europe, where everyone's a fascist and everything is America's fault. So the need for an intelligent left-wing contribution to debate about Russia and Ukraine is paramount. I will try and answer the question, which was triangular, about Russia, the West, and Ukraine, but I'll also try and respond to Lesia's request to say more about Ukraine as a subject. Firstly, Russia. Russia is addicted to a cycle of diversionary conflict, both to maintain domestic support and to distract the West from helping Ukraine. But also because Russia is actually still quite a weak state. Even after the defense build-up of recent years, it doesn't have the resources for all-out conflict or war. It can win local wars against regional enemies, however, but not against serious ones. So this is the first reason why the system needs what I would call medium intensity conflict. It has to be big enough to create a story, to shift the narrative, as I gather Peter was saying last night, and divert attention, but not so big as actually be difficult to fight. Medium level threat and medium level economic distress also during the current economic downturn also makes people cling to Putin, so long as that medium level does not become extreme, in which case there could be a systemic crisis. Medium intensity conflict is, of course, mainly PR war. Nothing is pure PR. Reality always bites back. But Russia's cynical leaders can cope with the blowback from medium intensity war. To their cynical point of view, a few thousand dead in the Donbass and a general economic disaster is medium or small scale. Same is true of the war in Syria. Reality has already bitten back, but a few score Russian dead can be hidden from Russian TV, which also doesn't show the hidden consequences of Russia's inaccurate bombing campaign. The important thing is that this is easily outweighed for the Kremlin by the PR benefits, showing up the impotence of the West, showing off Russia's new military might, even the late invented story about protecting apostolic Christians in the Levant. But the blowback from reality on the ground will inevitably get worse. Russia could stay in Syria and get bogged down, but its recent pattern has been to mess up and move on. It doesn't solve problems, it makes them worse, but mess up and move on is part of the pattern. So where might Russia go next? Given the paradigm of medium intensity war, I don't think it's likely that Russia would attack the Baltic states, though it could always miscalculate. Nor is Russia going to fight someone who can fight back. But why not the Balkans? Why not somewhere like Bosnia? This comes from an internal ECFR discussion, which I should credit. The risks are low. Russia has a good starting point with Serbia and Republika Srpska. Provocation would be easy to stage. Russia could claim to be defending Christians against Muslims again. Repairing the mess left behind by the West, and, most importantly, overcoming the humiliation of 1999. My second possible theatre would be Russia itself. A domestic provocation, terrorist act on Russian soil would not carry any danger of intervention by foreign powers. So what does all that mean for Ukraine in the West? The bad news for the West is that Russia, I think, sadly, is reading the situation correctly. The postmodern West has got attention deficit disorder. We've already forgotten about the Ukraine crisis. We forgot about Ukraine 5 minutes after the crisis started. We're also radically introspective. Everything is about us and our identity politics and our self-obsessions. The Dutch referendum in Ukraine, on Ukraine, is a case in point. I was trying to write an op-ed and kept on hitting a brick wall. Initially, apparently the Dutch think the Ukrainians are divided on the EU, like they are. But if you point out that Ukraine isn't divided, support for Russia's alternative union has collapsed, support for the EU is about 60%. That actually makes things worse, because from a Dutch perspective, that means a new potential applicant to the EU and more migrants. So I've actually been told not to write anything. The best solution is to keep the campaign boring and to hope that turnout falls below the necessary 30%. Over to 5. Can Ukraine regain the world's attention? Well, hopefully not by copying Russia, not by inventing its own versions of virtual conflicts. Though you can see some worrying but small tendencies towards this with recent events. The almost ceasefire in the Donbass in September ought to have focused attention on domestic reform. Instead, Hnatiuk jumped onto the bandwagon of the Crimean blockade. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, the blockade itself. But there are some good things to say, some good stories for Ukraine to tell. First, medium intensity conflict has its drawbacks. The West was fascinated, frozen by the idea of hybrid war when it was most discussed back in 2014. But Russia is actually also constrained by its false narrative of non-involvement in the Donbass. Dead Russian soldiers don't go home to a state funeral or a hero's welcome. Ukraine, on the other hand, is badly armed, but as an agent, is actually fighting an effective, openly declared defensive war. So Russia's hybrid war against Ukraine's conventional war, old-fashioned war, is basically a draw, and that's something to be proud of. But Ukraine certainly needs to change the narrative status quo, where only specialists and bureaucrats are paying attention to its problems. I don't think there's a magic formula here, and it's probably best to avoid the magic tricks of political technology. And as Jarosław was saying, Ukraine is back to mediocre. Right? It was worse under COVID. It's back to kind of slow and uncertain progress. You know, that doesn't make a great headline truth. But that's mainly at the level of the state. Ukraine has got two big success stories to tell. Firstly, it is the subject. And the key subject is civil society, as everybody says, where there are a lot of big success stories, good journalism, faith organizations helping IDPs. Ukraine has dealt with 2 million, that's well, 1.3 actually, with the others going to Russia, in a much better, albeit imperfect way that Europe has actually dealt with the supposedly bigger story of refugees coming from Syria. Ukraine is a new nation, a nation basically, arguably, formed in war. That makes it fragile, it makes it new, but difficult births ought to be a gripping story. Ukraine is more united than it was. A united Ukraine that cheers on its football fan teams is a good story. Shakhtar Donetsk finding a home in Lviv, I think, is a great story which hasn't been told properly. Jamala singing in Eurovision is a great story. Ukraine's vibrant youth culture is a great story, and one that addresses the key problem that Europe has. Institutional Europe is old, bureaucratic, its narrative is out of date. Youth are unimpeded, but they're also disaffected. Narrative Europe. So the average hipster in Madrid actually has a lot in common with their equivalents in Kiev. They don't know, but they're actually talking about the same things, about re-energizing their political system and broadening participation in it. But unfortunately, those stories are not as well known as they should be. And I'll finish there.
Thanks a lot for your answers, and I would like to refer probably to what has been said here, and to especially your thesis about West's introspective, that West is introspective. So it reminded me about one situation from my practice. I was taking an interview from Ukrainian soldiers, and I was asking them like why they decided to go to army and what they are fighting for. And what is curious, that several of them answered me that they actually are fighting for European values. So they are fighting like for the Europe. That's how they see the situation. So even if West are going to abandon Ukraine, it looks like Ukraine are not going to abandon West, even if it's like fictional West. But actually, my question is. If we're talking here about the West, what West are we talking about? If we talk about this Middle East crisis, there are at least two West. We have USA and Europe, and concerning Ukraine also probably it's even more West. And what is the role of, where is the place for Ukraine in this map? Because what I'm talking about, that Ukrainian people see themselves as a part of the West. But so I would like to clarify probably this notion of the West and what West we are talking actually about. And especially I would like you to think on this question in long-term perspective, as Jarosław supposed.
Ja może zacznę od tych żołnierzy.
Let me perhaps begin with the soldiers that are fighting for European values. Ivan Hrasov said yesterday that in Italy, the willingness to defend their own country, not the European Union, but just Italy, is declared by about 18% of people. In France, it's just a few percent more, 22 if I recall correctly. In the Ukraine, I think this is defined differently, slightly differently. It's not about willingness or lack of willingness, but let me just repeat, it's to be or not to be. So what I think is, well, God forbid, but if there was a situation in which young French people, young Italians were to face such a dilemma, well, it seems now, let me be cynical, that it costs a lot less to support the Ukrainian struggle rather than have to be involved themselves. And I'm sure that is terribly cynical what I'm saying, but if any arguments are to actually resonate, perhaps these would. Now, when we talk about how Ukrainians define the West and what the West is to them, let me perhaps get inspired by what is quite well known is Igor Shevchenko's essay, Ukraine Between the East and the West, where the author speaks about the fact that the West came to Ukraine wearing a Polish suit. And today, what Ukrainian citizens consider the West, and I'm diverging here from the policy of the Ukrainian president, but for Ukrainian citizens, the West is predominantly Poland. Poland is the most popular country. The Polish are the most popular nation, the most liked nation among Ukrainians. I would say that perhaps this is unrequited love, moderately speaking, but I think that there is a huge capital here that Poland should tap on, huge potential, rather than try and antagonize it. And responding to the question what the West is, very often when Ukrainians speak about the West or Europe, well, this resembles the very well-known essay, Captive, Europe Kidnapped. This is a project and a narrative that was very much contemporary to the 1990s. Just to recall the essays of Yuri Andruchovich. Today, the outlook to the West is a lot more varied, diversified. It's not the same anymore. It's not as if this is just one big entity. And it seems that, well, the fact that Ukrainians most frequently come to Poland, that's a fact, but there already is a huge potential of a capital of knowledge and experience in terms of the relations with other EU member states and the United States and Canada as well, which is also relevant. The role of Canada has been quite important for Ukraine.
we heard this morning that the big concepts are very problematic. Civilization, West, whatever it is a very problematic concept, but in a sense, if you change the optics, we're talking not about some kind of real reality, but as a told reality, as a kind of narrative. So here we come with something which could help us think better, and the better is that what we know from the works of many brilliant historians, that West, East as the concept has been invented in West by the end of 18th century as a part of Enlightenment project, as something which is opposed to the so-called normal, modern, civilized West, and in between this modern civilized West and the Asia, whatever it means, but most it's a barbaric, undeveloped country. And here's the region which is in between. It's neither West nor Asia. So this is Eastern Europe. So this is the part of the story that very much West, East has been invented by the West by the end of 18th century, within the realm of the Enlightenment narratives. So here I'm coming to. Now we have a quite different, opposite of a situation. Now it is the East who's narrating what West is. Now it's telling, creating some kind of narrative about the West, and this is nowadays very much part of Ukrainian narrative. Because Ukrainians believe, many Ukrainians believe that West does exist. They also believe that something which is called European values does also matter, to the extent that many of them were ready to sacrifice many things, including life. And it's not a banal thing, believe me, because these people died on the, and I know some of them, so to say, so I know it's for them more extremely important. So what I'm saying here, this I see something like a first as an irony on the other one hand, but also the chance. The irony is that this is Ukraine who defines what West could be. This is kind of new narrative. And as a matter of fact, it's not that much naive. I would like to refer to a book of Timothy Gordon Ash, whose name not to be supposed to be introduced. Right after Maidan, he wrote a book about post-communist transformation, and he made this point that probably the first Maidan, Ukrainian Maidan, was one of the few events when Brussels and Washington works on the same line with solidarity, so to say. I would say, to some extent, this situation has been repeated, iterated after the second Maidan, because of the sanctions, and because they emerged some kind of the solidarity. So what I'm saying here, West is not a given concept. West is something which is discussed, narrated, made, all the kind of things. So what I'm saying here, that ironically, or not probably ironically, is the Ukrainian crisis that gives a chance for rise of New West. The other side, the other story is this: if this is creation, this narrative could be some kind of realized, so to say, make it real. But it's not for me as a historian to discuss. And secondly, this is my first point. And secondly, I believe this new narration of Ukraine about the West is very much utopian. It's utopia. But the thing is, you cannot deal with it without utopia. I believe Czesław Mill was very right when he was saying that the worst thing that happened after the fall of the communism, that there is no new alternative set of ideas has emerged, any kind of ideologies. Because the only ideology which emerged mostly was consumerism, in some kind of the new liberal version, so to say. But this is not that could provide people with the idea of solidarity. Why should they care about the other country, about the social crisis they live? If this is only about the consumerism. It's not a new idea. It's an idea of the Lesia Kolakowski, whom I admire. It's an idea of Tony Judd. Tony Judd wrote a brilliant book about grand illusion. That basically we see European Union as a union of values. He says it's a nonsense. Because European Union is a very pragmatic project united around interests. And the interest is very simple. Never again war, and create some kind of large economical space. And values, they matter as a kind of smokescreen. That was all. So now I say we're coming to the point. And Ukrainian crisis is probably one of the points. I'm not saying Ukraine is the only crisis. This all been discussed, because we're just not paying that much attention to this kind of discussions. So whether interests would suffice, whether pragmatism would suffice to keep this creation together without some kind of the idea of identity, with some kind of narration, with some kind of project utopia, with some kind of values. The irony is that most Europeans, more specifically their leaders, claim the values which they could not defend. And I believe most of them don't believe these values. This is just nice smoke ring. And here in Ukraine, we have some kind of space in Ukraine, I believe also some other spaces. When people treat these values extremely seriously. So what I'm driving at, some of my intellectuals who whom appreciate, whom I take it very seriously, says that the Ukrainian crisis is more about Ukraine per se. It's more about Europe. It's about our way of speaking about the future world. In what way we should think is there is no real shelf of books they can grasp to a book from there, grab a book from there and understand the situation. Not that we have one book, we just even have text, we don't even have words to discuss this. Just the words are lacking, so to say. And this what I'm driving at. So what he's saying is, what the main argument was, Marcy Shore, again, name which not been introduced. She basically, after during Maidan, she says that what is very important about Ukraine, about Ukrainian crisis, it's a signalizing end of postmodernism. Very much like Pomerantsev was saying, that Russia was exemplary postmodern autocracy. Because here you have something which is supposed to be for real, taken for real, for seriously, that utopia matters, that sometimes it takes a courage to repeat some formula that look very banal, but all of a sudden they become very real and very serious. So just to conclude, I believe that crisis here as Ukrainian, I know about the Syrian crisis, I couldn't other things, is a very good chance for Europe itself to reconsider, to redefine itself, which is project for long, for a future, but it's of extremely importance from the future world it's supposed to do. I know it sounds very banal. I know it sounds very pathetic, but sometimes it takes courage to repeat these supposedly banal and pathetic words.
Well, being a Wilson, I've spent my whole life coming last, and my colleagues have already said something I was going to say. But leaving aside the kind of geographical aspect of the question, which Europe or America, there's a temporal aspect too. That the cultural revolution that began in 1968 is still ongoing, but arguably the intellectual revolution that began in 1968 has reached a dead end. As Slavka was saying, postmodernism is at an end, or at least the Ukraine crisis shows the dangers of over-radical relativism, of saying there's no truth and only narrative. In fact, commentators who have talked about a clash of narratives in the crisis around Ukraine are part of the problem. They're not contributing anything in terms of analysis. They are part of the problem. I recommend you read two recent reports. One was by European wise men about the future of Europe and Russia, and the other was by Kissinger's firm. And they say exactly the same wrong thing, that there's a clash of narratives. Right? Russia says one thing, and and the West has another story, and Ukraine has another story. Well, maybe one of them is right. So think big. This is a really important intellectual moment that Ukrainians can point out not just utopian things, but practical things. If you're living in Ukraine, this is what real propaganda is like. It's not like the lies that protect commercial interests, or the kind of advertising culture, or the reality TV culture that you have in the West. That's a different type of propaganda. This is old-fashioned Nazi-style big lie stuff. It's very, very.
Thanks for your answers. And I would probably give the word to the audience and probably have some questions to our panelists.
So, yeah. Yeah, here.
Yeah, I don't have to introduce myself, but I just want to say I'm a German living in Berlin, but mainly living in Greece. So I have a different perspective. And I just want to point to one problem of perception. I mean, given that the image of Greece in Germany is a very good example how distorted things can be. And the whole perception of the project of Europe, especially in the eyes of those who are in favor of the Europe of values, even in respect to Greece, is very wrong and very unrealistic. I mean, an average German would today say the Greeks were 50 years in the European Union and they still have the old clientelistic system, which is contrary to European values. So you must see this when we discuss Ukraine in, let's say, in German public opinion. You have the view they had two revolutions on Maidan, and still the power is in the same way based on first the oligarchs' influence and second clientelism and corruption. So this you must really take into view. And then we have the example of Romania and Bulgaria, where most Europeans would say, in any case, they were integrated too early into the European Union. They were not mature enough. So, and then take the last example, and I wonder why we don't discuss this more, being in Warsaw. The very fact that a country which is a model case for European progress, Poland, now is in a situation where really democracy is in danger. That's how I see it. And you have a defense minister who is a bit bizarre in his fixation on Smolensk, for instance. I mean, seen from Paris or Berlin, you wonder whether this country, Poland, is not an example that nothing can be sure in these developments. And I'm absolutely sure one of the big obstacles for the West seeing Ukraine in a positive perspective, as you hope, is of course the fact that countries like Hungary and Poland still have obviously the potential to develop in a very undemocratic way, and at least are in danger of not staying in the Europe which we want. So this I would like to mention, and maybe we should discuss it.
So you refer now to the. Okay. So dziękuję bardzo. Lekcji polskiej. Najpierw.
First, I wanted to make reference to Jarosław Hrycak's intervention
About evaluation of Euromaidan. And I agree with you, as we told before panel, that the perspective of Ukraine may be in short term not so optimistic, but there are nuances. And in this sense, if you look on the Ukrainian revolution, we should keep in mind that we have to deal with at least 3 different revolutions simultaneously. So one of them, we can call it like anti-colonial. And in this sense, indeed, Ukraine really said big bye to Russia. So in this sense, this anti-colonial attempt is visible in kind of result. In sense of democratic revolution, as it was a prize for against of kleptocratic regime of Yanukovych, we can see that the Ukrainian revolution actually failed, and this long and deep war
between Ukrainian society and Ukrainian ruling elites or political class, it's indeed at this moment difficult to say that Ukrainian society is winning. But maybe the main interesting point, it's a revolution of, we can call it revolution of values, or European Ukraine against of Soviet Ukraine, etc., etc. It's maybe even most important revolution or elements in those events, because it's ongoing process and it's really difficult to predict. And in this point, I'm more optimistic in the future of Ukraine, how it will develop. Because if you look on identity issues in Ukraine, you can see how quickly it's changed. If you will look on the social processes, it's really changing almost everything. And in this sense, probably don't have analytical tools to predict how it will develop in even nearest future. And in this sense, probably it's difficult to find any historical analogy, like should Ukraine now be in kind of looks on model of Eastern or Central Europe in 98, 89, etc., etc. And in this sense, probably we are observing the long and endless process, which are, in my opinion, more or less optimistic.
Yes, thank you very much. A question to Mr. Hrycak, if I may, but perhaps other panelists would like to react as well. You said that you would expect Ukraine to continue evolving at a rather slow pace going forward, but ever so slightly, slowly, and basically stagnation over the next 5 to 10 years. Well, even if forecasting is a difficult art and we really don't know, I see a certain tension between this part of your forecast and the other part of what you said, what you told us, namely the existence, the emergence of self-awareness in the young generation, the strength and resilience of the civil society, and the growing sense of dignity and national identity. I would imagine that with this kind of society growing in Ukraine and inability to meet that society's expectations and ambitions, there would be a growing tension and you would be heading towards a revolution, another Maidan of sorts. How realistic is that? I teach European integration here in Warsaw, and an Ukrainian student about a year ago or so told me, look, we do not see Poland really as much of a role model. You are not that far ahead and not that distant from us. What we are looking to is to emulate the examples from Germany, from the Netherlands. That's the benchmark for us. This is what we would like to achieve. Well, I told him, good luck. If you manage to continue at a fast rate and fast pace, you will be getting that within the next 40 to 50 years. And he told me, no, this must come and fast, and this is what we would expect. So this kind of tension does exist also in this country. We could expand on that, but I'm asking a question about Ukraine.
So maybe just these 2 questions more. Okay. So maybe we'll pick up these 2 questions more, and then you. Okay.
Andrzej Szeptycki, Uniwersytet Warszawski.
University. Just one remark and one question, if I may. Professor Hnatiuk spoke about the fact that it's not the Ukrainian crisis, but the European crisis. Of course, we are dealing with a crisis in the European Union, but we need to remember about the dependencies that link the Ukrainian war, rather than the crisis, with the European crisis. There are various locations, like the refugee crisis, Greece, and other situations, but we're dealing here with a number and a scale of problems that the West has not been tackling, has not been able to tackle since the 1970s. And that effectively influences the West's capacity, or the European Union's capacity to implement its wonderful projects. In the 1970s, the monetary union was suspended, and a few other projects were suspended because it was impossible in the contemporary environment to progress with them. So I think there is a dependency here, and that also contributes to the question at hand: is Ukraine abandoned? But it is clear that we cannot take advantage of this, as Moscow is doing, as an argument against Ukrainian aspirations and the European obligations. But it's predominantly a question to Professor Hrycak, although the remaining panelists, if they're willing to answer, I would be glad to hear it. The question is about the title of the panel. How do we see that against the attitude of Pope Francis? And I'm referring to the declaration adopted together with Cyril that, at least in Ukraine, was well received without much enthusiasm. I read some exotic interpretations that Pope Francis, since he couldn't wait to hear the support from the West, he searching for it with the Orthodox Church. But on a more positive note, there were some comments that this declaration of some of the Orthodox intellectuals addressed recently perhaps could be a positive outcome or a positive effect of this joint declaration of Francis and Cyril. So perhaps the outcome is not so bad after all. So, but I would like to hear, against this event, how do you see the policy of the Vatican? And another question.
Thank you. Anaïs Marin from Collegium Civitas. I have two questions for Andrew Wilson, please. First, regarding your hypothesis that Russia would, where would Russia want to mess things up next? I was surprised not to hear the word Belarus from you, and well, not going into details about the resilience of Belarus in such an event. It's a matter for another 2 days of conference. What do you think Russia has on its mind? And then perhaps we can also address the issue of the capabilities of Russia if ever it wanted to give the final blow and absorb Belarus, which to me sounds more like likely than Bosnia. Well, but please can develop here. And second, could you please comment on the statements made by Mrs. Hnatiuk regarding the confidence potential, the confidence capital that Poland enjoys in Ukraine? How, in your view, does that translate in Brussels? I have the feeling that Poland has kind of, Sikorski has exhausted the confidence capital of Poland with the Eastern Partnership, and when we look at which way the new neighborhood policy is going, we can wonder if there is still room for the views that were advocated at the time. So can Poland really influence still the EU on the Eastern neighborhood policy and on Ukraine in particular? Thank you.
We start with W as the first letter.
There are two questions directly to me. The first about Belarus. Unlikely, I would say. Belarus is a security state. It's not the only reason why Lukashenko's been in power for such a long time. He has a social contract, etc., which is fraying, but is still there. Both factors actually would work against Russian intervention. Lukashenko isn't going to run away. Belarus wouldn't collapse like a pack of cards. Direct intervention, I don't think would work. I mean, Lukashenko demonstrably changed national security strategy about little green men. You know, any of these fuckers appear here, without the rude word, he basically said, and it's an act of war. There are questions about the loyalty of KGB, etc., the army, a lot of whom were trained in Russia. But I don't think Belarus would collapse in the same way. I'm sure you all noticed the fascinating minutes of the Ukrainian National Security Council the day after Russia began its operation in Crimea, where they're saying, God, we've got no army. We can't send anybody down to Crimea because we have to defend Kiev with the few men we've got. This is a surprise to most of them, but clearly Russia knew this, right? It knew that Ukraine was an open door then, not now. But their analysis of Belarus could not possibly be the same. Right? There are other ways of interfering, but not in a kind of hybrid war scenario, I don't think. Poland, Brussels, and the Eastern policy. Oh, crikey. Well, did Sikorski exhaust confidence capital? Yes and no. I mean, to use a favorite Polish word, solidarity, the last Polish government actually learnt the game of influence in Brussels quite well. Yes, it pushed the Eastern Partnership, but it was seen as a player on, you know, general European issues as well. So it wasn't just a special issue advocate. So it could build coalitions of support. So what slightly worries me about the peace government is that it's ironically nationalist, in the sense that it narrows your focus and it makes you less of a solidarity player in that kind of diplomatic game in Europe. Future of the Eastern Partnership in general, it isn't going to die because EU policies never formally get abandoned, but it is looking, I mean, it's been already subject to yet another review, and the key word that kept on reappearing was stability, right? Not transformation. Stability in the neighbourhood is now a priority, I think, for the EU. So de facto, it's been downgraded. First and second question, my colleagues will have much to say about. My take, sort of putting them together, I would argue, although others might disagree, revolutions away from post-communism are more difficult than revolutions away from communism, and they were difficult enough for a variety of reasons. One is that Russia was less of a factor in the 90s. It wasn't actively stopping or hindering attempts to transform, whereas now it's what academics would call a black night. You know, it's an active negative player because it doesn't want the example spreading. But more broadly, sort of pathologies develop over 20, 25 years. Systems are self-replicating. So it's very, very difficult, but not impossible, to transform these kind of entrenched post-communist, you know, sort of patronal, corrupt societies. If it's impossible, that's really depressing. So whether Ukraine succeeds or not is hugely important. And there are elements for optimism, civil society, some good politicians, excuse me. But as Slavko said, opportunities were missed in 2014. So I actually agree with the questioner here. You have countervailing forces. And nobody likes the phrase third Maidan. Right? That suits Russia's narrative. The first and the second Maidan, one was a protest against election fraud, one was against a consolidating autocrat. That's very, very different from a dysfunctional elected government. Right? So taking up arms against it, you know, is not something you necessarily have a right to do in a democracy. I get the sense that people want change and they're thinking of different non-Maidan ways to do it, right? Because the Maidan scenario, the third Maidan, would play into Russia's path, Russia's plans. But those tensions are big and will get bigger.
when it comes to the Pope, the answer is relatively easily, at least for me. Since I come in Catholic University, I believe I understand his logic, so to say. Pope Francis tried to act not just a good Catholic, he tried to act as like a good Christian, which means show humility, to be very humble. That's what he put very explicitly. There is no precondition that I wouldn't accept from the Moscow Patriarchate to come with some kind of the common statement, so to say. So you remember all the story. Whatever he addressed the Russian Patriarch, choose the territory on every condition. I will go there, will come there. I say whatever, will go there. So it's kind of humiliation, humble. It's a Christianity, so to say. In this sense, it's a very good Christian act, and I do understand it. As Ukrainian, I don't understand. I could not accept it because politics is different from the religion here. And I'm happy that secular and the religious power, they're separated, so to say. And I believe there was a sound response from Ukrainian side. There was one response was given by the head of the Greek Catholic Church. By the way, they know each other on the very good terms because our nowadays head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, he was for a long time a bishop in Argentina, so they know each other. And actually, Francis reacted to his reaction, which was, I would say, was very well versed and sufficiently, I would say, aggressive. And secondly, most of us decided we just to ignore it because I don't really see what kind of the role or the significance this, so to say, agreement could play in political relations. It's mostly about kind of symbolical role or religion, thing like that, but I wouldn't discuss in that. Now, secondly, I have my own classification of the countries or the states. I believe I divide them into groups. The states that are idiot-proofs, who could take any idiot to come to power. That's, forgive me my political correctness, like having 2 Bushes or even more than 2 Bushes under junior Bushes twice. America could stand it. And there are some countries which are not, which are still not. And Ukraine and Russia is not idiot-proof. Because any idiot could come to power and to create more than a chaos. You create a danger. So in this sense, I believe there is clear and distinctive division between Poland and Ukraine. I believe Poland, I hope very much, that Poland is idiot-proof. It could take any idiot, and I would give the name nowadays. And I believe, Ukraine is wished to be in the state, which means being some structures, long-standing structures, have kind of another trajectory. And this is what Maidan was about. And unfortunately, the political class could not deliver it for a variety of reasons to discuss. But mostly because you could teach old dog new tricks. Most of this political class is very much old or already informative within the system. And here is the main challenge, because what you have there, you have a society which is, I'm not saying it's a majority, but it's a rather large minority, according to some estimation, for 5 to 20% in the country, which is very motivated, solidarized, activated, things like that. But there is a large problem with this society. This society is mostly it's a very generation-based, as I said. This generation has a specific traits, specific character features, which belongs to this generation Y, so-called. And there's this feature which everywhere, be it United States, Arabic world, or Ukraine. And this is so-called peer generation. Generation of the big, of the thumbs. Generation of the social networks. I mean, this is the idea is the social horizontal solidarity, which means they could easily make a flash mob, organize something like a volunteering action through collecting money through the network. They will go to the protest, to Maidan, all the kind of things. But they don't want to go into politics, because politics for them is vertical. And they dislike, they don't probably hate, but they dislike these horizontal things very much. It doesn't belong to the experience, so to say. And therefore, 2 reasons, which is very obvious, it's everywhere. It's first, they don't like voting. And therefore, it's every country nowadays. They don't go voting, mostly, in many cases. And secondly, they don't form parties, and they don't go into the parties. So this is the main challenge. How you transform this big energy, a horizontal society, in the vertical power? Because the main leverage for the change is in the power, in the state. society doesn't have liver. More so, if you remember Gerschenkron, he says more to the east, the more state is important. You couldn't have ignore the state. My hypothesis is, if Ukrainian Maidan, last Maidan, would happen 20-some years before, like in Poland, by this generation will now is 25 years aged, therefore the situation will be different. We will have this kind of real smooth transformation from the horizontal solidarity to the political power. Unfortunately, we live in a new world. And in this sense, to give you just an idea, and I'll finish with that. If you understand Maidan, don't think about nationalism that much. Don't even think about the previous Maidan, because the previous Maidan was very much vertical. Yushchenko was a god there. The second Maidan, all leaders, at least in the better stage, they were just ridiculed and mocked. Nobody treated them seriously. Very much, by the way, like United States and European Union. It's just to say, to make a comment to the statement which made by the lady, but at the very beginning, the Ukrainians shared some illusions. They didn't share illusions, at least this part of Maidan. They have no illusions. So the thing is how to transform this energy, and the thing is, it's a very same-much problem like the Occupy movement, like the protest on the Taksim Street, like protest on Bolotnaya. This is the same phenomenon. The only exception, the only difference between Maidan and this movement, that so far Maidan managed to win. But this is victory which was momentous. Nowadays, how could you transform, or where do you transform this momentous victory into some kind of sustainable political action? And this is the major challenge which we don't know answer to. But what I'm seeing now in Ukraine is now going through the political crisis and tribulation. And what I see now, more and more former leaders of Maidan trying to ways to be catapulted into powers. Because they have a nice rise of new phenomenon like a Saakashvili movement. Everybody's now, it's kind of interesting. Most of the leaders, they're smart, trying to be smart. They're not talking about the parties, they're talking like a movements. Because movements is more horizontal, so to say. So I'm saying here, probably it takes us longer. Probably is the mission impossible, this transformation, or probably it takes longer. Why it's nice to be a historian? Because you have to live long to see that.
Well, I think my colleagues have answered most of the questions. I would like to really respond to a question. I forgot your name, I do apologize. But the person who was asking from Germany, and this question was whether this example, a Polish example in particular, is not a good exemplification, that you can never be certain of everything, of anything. Of course, you cannot be certain. And this is ongoing plebiscite that we are continually subject every day to trials and choices. The subject of this panel was not Poland, and none of us, and I'm the only Polish citizen, and I could possibly feel empowered to speak critically about the present-day situation in Poland, but it seems to me that it's bad, but not as bad, to believe, as Julia Wladimirovna Tymoshenko said, that все пропало. Well, it's not everything is lost, particularly in terms of Polish-Ukrainian relations. So things are not that bad. However, I would focus on a broader issue of what is actually happening in Europe. Namely, to use a Gombrowicz of trying to put an evil face, put a fascist face on Ukraine. In Ukraine, no right-wing party has actually won a seat in the parliament. So let's remember, let's recall, and let's not speak now about painful for me Polish example, but let's try to look at the support for right-wing parties in the old France, an old democracy. And how has it happened that in a country like Austria, such things could happen as what we had seen, where the right wing had come into power? How did it come about that this is now happening in the post-communist countries? It's not God's finger, but or some divine power, but in the success of the radical right wing throughout Europe. There's a lot of Moscow money. Many of those movements enjoy the support, financial support, and see this clever trick. A good example of Russia propaganda manipulation. On the one hand, anti-Nazi rhetoric, and on the flip side, supporting those quasi-fascist, racist, xenophobic movements throughout the European Union. The purpose why this is done, we already spoke about this from the beginning of this conference, so I will not reiterate. But what is important is that this collective European shadow is now cast over a country, to a country where such right-wing parties don't have any support. So this is the top manipulation, a propaganda campaign. It's very similar to this mechanism that Jarosław spoke about and Nadia Wolf wrote about in the book Inventing History in Europe. This is putting on one's own defects, one's own insufficiencies, and an inability to deal with the situation, and putting that face on somebody else that you can simply put your finger at. So the right wing is not the problem in the Ukraine, and definitely not as big a problem as it's made out to be.
Questions? Because it's time to finish the discussion, unfortunately. And okay, then it's going to be the last.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Yasir Aziz and I'm from Pakistan. And I also want to thank the Institute for Advanced Study for this opportunity. My question is very simple to Mr. Jarosław Hrycak. Yeah, so my question is very simple about future of Ukraine. After living 6 years in Ukraine, I remember Ukraine in the times of Mr. Yanukovych, and I also been during this historical moments of Euromaidan. So my question is, how much you're optimistic about Ukraine in forthcoming years? Because we see a common perception of Ukrainian people. They are, they're too optimistic about being a part of this European integration. We see our young fellows all keep talking about this European integration, about so apart from that, my second question is also connected to Mr. Nadia Savchenko case. What do you think about her? This case. What's going to be an outcome of this Nadia Savchenko case? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, but you choose the wrong person. I'm not a historian, not a prophecy maker. So I'm better dealing with the past rather than with the future. So it's very hard for me to predict, more so because the idea is West versus East, Russian speakers versus Eastern speakers. This is already a point which has been, to say, passed away. And I believe the two Maidan, especially last Maidan, and specifically this Ukrainian-Russian war, because you probably know it or not, during this kind of the fighting within Donetsk, the Donbass airport, there has been a correspondent of Los Angeles Times, who is Russian by origin. He understands Russian. But he was amazed that both waging powers, fighting powers, they were waging the war in Russian language. He says the one difference is that Ukrainian side use more literary language than those who are on the Donbass side. More intelligent, he says that. More sophisticated. But this is so far the only difference that he managed, so to say. But it's also something indicative. So what I'm saying here, most likely, we are now facing new reality when Ukraine is becoming kind of more and more civic and less ethnic nation. And this is here to stay. For sure with crisis, with divisions, but difference of another kind. Not necessarily divisions, this kind of cultural divisions, but generational divisions, ideological divisions, and also very importantly, new kind of division between the large cities and the other Ukraine. Because between the potential winners and the losers of this reform. The third, I would be very happy to make this prediction, but I'm not sure whether this is real, because I believe in a long time, Ukraine would belong to European Union on the condition that European Union will still exist. This is because I know what happened to the European Union. This is the main challenge. But the thing is that there is probably no other country nowadays in Eastern Europe which is not that much interested in the existence and the strength of the European Union as Ukraine, because for Ukraine it's an existential issue. Because to fight with Russia, to stand up to Russia until we don't have the crisis in Russia, Ukraine have to access to resources. And resources not in Poland, I'm sorry to say that, versus Endespell reform, not Visegrad group. Most of the resources they're in European Union, or more specifically in Berlin and Washington. And Ukraine badly needed this kind of resources to stand up these challenges. The irony is, and here we come this Polish question, this Polish issue. I believe this is kind of bitter irony that in the time when Ukraine really needs kind of strong Europe, Poland is acting quite to the contrary. Because Poland, if Ukraine is willing to be as close to Berlin, Poland is traveling in the other direction. So in a sense, I believe that with Ukraine and Poland will still be talking about strategical relationship, friendship, Balkan alliances, but it would mean nothing because it was just idle talks. Because strategically, as a matter of fact, tactically, the interest is now going in the very divergent situation. And again, I believe that probably the final question, when it sounds banal, Ukraine will be what will make of it. And I see some actors in Ukraine, which are in the making of Ukraine. It is quite new actors. They are not political leaders, mostly. They're not, it's mostly, it's the three elements, because I'm a member of the think tank, and as a member of the think tank, which analyzing situation, trying to come to some visions, we are traveling around Ukraine. And the most frequently we are invited by the three groups. First of all, it's the young people, and they're very much organized. They won't see solution, and they're going to talk about it. The second is more interesting. It's a middle class, not middle class, but mostly to second, middle business or upper. This kind of the post-industrial service business, IT sector, all these kind of things, because this very much threaten this country, so to say. And thirdly, most interestingly, and this is what we failed to discuss, it's oligarchs. Some oligarchs, like Taruta, because they also don't see not just future of themselves, their country. They don't see the future of their capitals in this country. If nothing has been changed, so they're facing a kind of the real problems. So you see, having those three actors in the state, in this society, it's already a lot. Especially if we don't have any of these actors 10 years ago. So I'm saying it's a kind of configuration. Therefore, you could not be that much sure about the future, but you know there is a future.
Thanks a lot. I'm sorry, I guess we need to finish. Unfortunately, it's really...
Okay, I can answer about Savchenko, yes? Because you are asking what is the prediction or prediction?
Well, you have to call it what it is. You know, she's a hostage in a show trial. She's not the only one, sadly. Why does any country engage in this process? Well, to intimidate your enemies, partly deliberately to show how arbitrary your justice is, and to trade. Right? So, Oleg Sentsov, the film director, got 20 years last year. Yeah, but he could be out in 2 minutes, you know, if Russia wants to trade. And I guess the same fate awaits Savchenko. She'll be given a long sentence. She'll be out very quickly if people protest enough.
Thank you. So it's really a lot of issues to discuss more, but unfortunately we have to finish and we need to conclude. And I remember that yesterday Ivan Krasov said that it's hard to think about Russia. It's hard to predict Russia because the source of its politics is a fear. It's like a feeling of the threat, and this is the starting point for the Russian politics strategies. And what seems to me that we are like close to fall into the same trap, because the second day of the conference we speak too much about threats. Like we speak about threat of Russia, the threat of Middle East, the threat of ISIS, the threat of immigrants, the threat of unsuccessful EU members, and so on. So it's like we're losing probably some other important points, coordinates, like trying to define our strategies out of these fears. And that's why probably I would like to finish the conference and this panel with something pathetic, and said that like a year ago, 2 years ago, Ukraine believed in the Europe, probably fictional Europe, I don't know, the strength for Ukrainian society, and it's still, and this energy is still circulating inside Ukrainian society. As Jarosław Hrycak said, that really Ukrainian people are now searching the answers for the questions that is important for the future of Europe also. So I would like to present Ukraine as a very important experimental field where this European project has new chance to be redefined, because it's really what we're searching for some new strategies and new answers. And my proposal is that like Ukrainian people once believed in Europe, probably it's time for Europe to believe in the utopia of Ukraine, and it could be the strength for the European vision. Thanks.
Like that very well. It was really great. It was great that there was a